All right. In this video, we are going to look at the genetics of depression. So, the textbook takes the position of a moderate degree of influence on developing depression. Some studies take the position of a very high degree of genetics being involved in depression, but there's definitely evidence that genetics do are seem to be involved in depression. So, here's an interesting fact. So, if you get people who get depression before the age of 30, that's early onset depression, they seem to have a high number of relatives with a variety of different disorders, such as depression, anxiety disorders, alcohol and marijuana use, obsessive compulsive disorder, bulimia, irritable bowel syndrome, and migraine headaches. So, like your textbook, if you read the first part of the chapter, that opened with this notion of like, wow, somebody with post traumatic stress disorder or schizophrenia, their symptoms vary so greatly that one case may look nothing like another case. And they talked about how it's so interesting that some people with depression seem to respond to drugs that increase dopamine levels, and then there's other people with depression that seem to respond to drugs that decrease dopamine levels. And with the antidepressants, what happens is the doctors usually try you on one and they say, oh, does it work? And so there's this notion that maybe there's not a gene for a specific disorder, but maybe there's a host of genes that seem to play a role in all of our mental disorders. So then another interesting fact is that if you get depression after the ages of 45 or 50, called late onset depression, they find that your relatives tend to have circulatory problems. So they're starting to do research in that, which seems pretty fascinating to me. Now, this next slide. I've got this great video that I think is going to make this much more dynamic for you, but I'm going to do my best to verbally walk you through it. So there's these things called a serotonin transporter gene, and we each have two copies. So they did a study with 847 participants, and they tracked them for 5 years, looking at, hey, have you gone through stressful events? Like, have you been through a divorce, a major breakup? Did you lose your job? Did you have a financial setback? Something like that. And so they had to record these events for 5 years. And then they looked at these genes and they found people with too short serotonin transporter genes were much more likely to have a tendency for depression as a result of a major negative event. On the other hand, the people with too long serotonin transporter genes, they could have these negative events and they didn't seem to lead them towards this feeling of depression. And then, which would make sense, if you had one short and one long, then you had like a moderate, an intermediate tendency to get depression. Maybe, maybe not, but more likely to than two people with two long genes. So let's summarize this up. If you have this research said if you have two short serotonin transporter genes, then you're more likely to get depressed as a result of negative life events. If you have too long, you can have a negative life event and you're not likely to get depressed. And then if you have one short and one long, you kind of more likely to than the too long, but not as much as the too short. So let's take a look at this great video that I think is going to give you a really dynamic view of this serotonin transporter gene.
With over 350 million people affected by depression worldwide, it's no doubt an incredibly real and serious issue. But what exactly is going on inside of a depressed person? Is there a biological basis for these intense feelings of sadness? In the past, depression was often described as simply a chemical imbalance in the brain. Specifically, scientists believed that a lack of the neurotransmitter serotonin was to blame, which is often referred to as the feel-good chemical. However, the only real evidence for this was that when some depressed people were prescribed drugs which increased serotonin levels, it helped alleviate their symptoms. But while chemicals most certainly are involved, this view doesn't really capture just how complex depression is. In recent years, scientists began to notice that the brain cell growth and connections may actually actually play a larger role. When we look at the brain of a depressed person, studies show that the hippocampus tends to be much smaller than average. Other areas of the brain are also physically affected, but this region in particular controls memory and emotion. And the longer a person has been depressed, the smaller the hippocampus becomes. The cells and networks literally deteriorate. It turns out that stress may actually be a main trigger in the decrease of new neurons in this area of the brain. In fact, studies have shown that when this region of the brain is regenerated and new neurons are stimulated, mood improves. Interestingly, many modern drugs, including those which affect serotonin levels, have an indirect effect on the growth of brain cells. This is likely why serotonin-based drugs seem to help some patients, but not for the reasons we once thought. Instead, they promote the release of other chemicals which ultimately stimulate neurogenesis, or the growth of new neurons. Knowing this, some scientists now believe focus should be on drugs which directly affect neurogenesis. But while your neurons and chemicals may be the direct influencers, many genetic factors have been discovered as well. One particular study found that a variation in the serotonin transporter gene leaves individuals more vulnerable to depression. Every individual has 2 copies of the gene, one from each parent, and this gene can either be short or long. After tracking 800 young adults over 5 years, the study revealed that 33% of individuals with one short version became depressed after stressful life events, and people with 2 short genes fared even worse. On the other hand, those with 2 long genes were much less likely to become depressed with similar life stress. Many other genes have been identified which increase the likelihood of depression too, and it makes sense when you consider that depression and bipolar disorder both run in families. Studies of identical twins show that if one has bipolar disorder, the other has a 60 to 80% chance of developing it too. So while the true cause or causes of depression have yet to be pinned down precisely, and trust us, there's a huge list of other variables that studies suggest may come into play, it's important to remember that depression is a disease with a biological basis, along with psychological and social implications. It's not simply a weakness that somebody should get over, or even something that we have a say in. And just like heart disease or cancer, shedding light onto the subject is of the utmost importance in order to bring funding and proper research.